Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 266th, being recorded on Thursday, August 13th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, I'm also going to be your presenter. And it's funny, after not having presented in 5 years, this is the second time in a couple months, but just wanted to fill in the slot. It was available. We've got another talk this evening, and this slot was available, and I've had this talk been wanting to offer. So glad to see some of you come here to join. As always, the meetings are recorded. You'll be able to go check it out afterwards at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. And this session will be migrating or comparing CF admin settings. And the full title goes on to say across instances, versions, and even engines. So let's go ahead and get started. Hey folks, just a quick comment I'm adding in after the fact. During the session, there were a couple of brief moments of audio hang up, but they're very brief, so they shouldn't take away from the value of the session. There was one particular point where, for some reason, something wasn't appearing on screen. I've added that here as an edit after the fact, so enjoy the rest of the recording. All right, let's dive in. So have you ever wanted to migrate all your CF admin settings to initially set up an instance, basing it on some other instance? Yeah, that's a very common need. Or maybe you want to migrate some settings, but not all the settings. There's different solutions for each problem. And then sometimes I've worked with people all the time troubleshooting problems. You might just want to compare settings between instances, trying to find out what's different. And there's some old school ways to do it that were kind of tedious, and there's some more modern ways to do it that some of you already know about. And then there may be a way that I'm going to show you that'll surprise you that you maybe never even considered. And so I would just ask you rhetorically, how would you do these things? And again, there's some ways to do it that are a lot more tedious than others. And you may not only want to do these between one version of CF and another, like jumping from CF11 to CF 2018 or 2016, 2018. And then you might want to do it from one CF instance to another. And that could be on the same machine, or it could be between machines. And then most interestingly, some of you may want to migrate settings from CF to Lucee or Lucee to CF. And yes, there are solutions for all these things, ways to do all these things. And so today I'm going to show you these things, and I'm going to throw in some tips and warnings and best practices along the way. First, we're going to see the migration wizard that Adobe has long had in ColdFusion. It's offered at the end of CF installation when you first launch the admin. If it detects that there's a previous version, it says, hey, do you want me to migrate those settings in? And then we're going to talk about the ColdFusion archive feature, the CAR mechanism. And that's been in CF for a very long time, and the interface shows that it hasn't really changed a whole lot in years. But that's for moving, exporting settings out of the admin, and we'll talk about its benefits and challenges when we get to that. Now, some of you know that CommandBox is an open source project that's available free to use with ColdFusion or Lucee. CommandBox has a module called CFCONFIG. You can also use that for doing these things. And the thing that I want to make sure people understand is that it's easy to fall in the trap of thinking, well, I don't use CommandBox to manage my instances, therefore that won't help me. It can be used even for any CF or Lucee instance. It doesn't need to be one that you're running under CommandBox. So that may be a big surprise for some people. It's very easy. Once you see how to do it, you go, I think I'll try that approach. And then CF 2020, which is coming out this year, supposedly the beta is about to come out. There's a feature within it, which Adobe's already demonstrated publicly, which is like CFCONFIG. And of course, that'll rankle some people, but not everybody wants to use a third-party tool. They want to use what Adobe provides. And so in CF 2020, Adobe is providing a tool called CF Setup. And it, too, is a way from the command line to do these things that we're talking about, especially migrating settings and looking at them, things like that. And then finally, a little special treat, I think, I'm going to show you yet another tool which you maybe have never seen, never thought to use, and it can help with comparing the settings between instances. And it'll be something I'll show you can do in a couple ways, which maybe one you'll go, oh, I knew that, and the other one you'll go, whoa, I didn't know that. So anyway, we'll get to that later. And it's a free cross-platform tool, so whether you're on Windows, Linux, Mac, doesn't matter. And it'll be able to handle even CF's WDDX formatted XML files. So we'll get back to that later. But what's cool is that the tool will be of benefit for you even beyond just using for this job. You can use it to compare your code, your logs, any text. Of course, that giving away some of it. But anyway, let's move on. So these slides, what I'm going to show you, which will include the steps for doing the demos, I'll give you the commands, are available at after the session at my website. I don't know why it got cut off there, but it should say at my website, which again, in the bottom right corner, you'll be able to be reminded all the time, carehart.org. That's my site. All right, let's move on to the first big thing. And then let me get the chat open just in case somebody's saying something that, since I'm in charge, I'm the host and the speaker, I want to keep an eye on it, make sure there's no trouble. Okay, cool, no trouble. All right. So first up, migrating CF admin settings. And first we're going to talk about doing it with traditional tools, the things that maybe some of you have heard of before. And the first was that first launch migration wizard is the formal name for it. So if it detects that a previous installation of CF is on the same machine, then it offers on the first launch of the administrator to show you a screen to lead you through migrating your settings. And rather than demo, because I don't want to set up actually doing it right now, I'm going to first just show you that in the docs, I'll tell you where this is later, but it is documented, and this is the screen that you would see. And again, it's been there for other releases too. It's not new to 2018. So you would, when you're on your first launch of the admin after installation, if it detected prior version, it would say, do you want to do the migration? And you'd say yes, and it would ask you to log in, and it would say, okay, I'm getting ready to set things up. And then it would say, I'm going to now migrate these settings, things like, data sources and custom tags and scheduled tasks, all that stuff. And it gives a little more insight. You can read about that on your own. And then you'd say next, or you could say skip if you decided you didn't want to do it. You could say, no, don't do it. And you just be led into the administrator. But if you said next, then it would hopefully work and say successfully migrated. And if it fails, there's going to be a log telling you what failed, and you can dig into that on your own. And the logs are in the ColdFusion logs folder. So you maybe you've never even thought to look there for these logs, but yes, right after you do an installation, if you do a migration, look in there and see if there's a migration log and a migration exception log. And if there's any trouble, look at it and figure out what it's about. And there's all kinds of different things. And I don't want to really get into all the different things you could have happen and how to fix them. But I'll just say sometimes it'll be obvious from the error message. Sometimes you could Google it and find something. But if you're really stuck, this is what I do for a living. Not this particularly, but I troubleshoot problems with ColdFusion and Lucee. So if you can't find the answer, within 15 minutes and you don't want to keep digging around, just reach out to me down the bottom right corner, email or Twitter, and I'll take direct messages without you having to follow or be followed. So, all right. Now this is interesting. You might go, well, that's really cool. Oh, wait a minute. Someone's saying lost audio. Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Sorry. That's very disconcerting to hear someone say lost audio. It goes in and out once in a while. Does anybody else feel that it goes in and out patchy at times? What? That's so weird. I never, ever have that problem. I talk all day with people. And we're not on Connect, so you can't blame Connect this time. Cool. It's good to hear somebody say crystal clear. So let me just say this about that. Sometimes if other people say it's crystal clear the whole time and you feel it's patchy at times, it might be on your end. You could have something stealing network bandwidth. It could be something else running on your machine. It could be something else in your network. It could be, if you're at home, somebody upstairs watching an HD TV and somebody else is playing games and someone else is downloading big files. So anyway, glad to hear it's crystal clear. We're going to assume that would mean then that the recording will have it crystal clear. So hopefully that's all going to go good. Anyway, getting back to this. So this is interesting because if you skipped it, you might think, oh, that was going to be really useful. We would have liked to have been able to bring all those settings over. Or let me present a different scenario. you're on a machine where you've installed, say, CF 2018, and you did not have CF 2016 or 11 or 10, whatever you had. And you might go, man, I really would have liked if it would have imported it, but it wasn't on the same machine. Well, we're going to see later there's another solution for that, but I want you to know that there is also built in the feature to trigger running this import wizard manually. Yes, and it's documented, and I have a blog post where I talk about it, and I point to the docs to find out about it, and it's really pretty simple. There's the link to the blog post, and again, the presentation is available online for you to go get. But briefly, what you do, just check this out, you copy the Neo XML file. Some of you know what that is. And again, the docs describe it in more detail. But you copy the Neo XML files from the previous release into a particular folder that you create in your new instance. And I want to be clear, I'm saying after you've installed the new instance, you can come back days, weeks, months later, you can come back and do this. So you copy the Neo XML files into a particular folder. I'll show you in a moment doing it. And then you modify a file called the admin config XML. And again, the docs tell you where it is. And you basically tweak a couple of lines that say rerun the wizard. And then you log into or refresh the administrator, and boom, it'll trigger running the tool. So let me go ahead and show you that. So the folder, so let's say in my ColdFusion 2018 CFusion Live, and again, the docs tell you where to put it, I would create a folder, let's say called CF 2016 settings. Literally, that's the name. It's a formal name defined in the documentation. So in the ColdFusion CFusion Live, if that's where I want to do the import in the CFusion instance, I create this CF 2016 settings, and I go to my CF 2016 and I copy out the Neo XML files. These are them if you haven't seen it. All the CF admin settings are stored in a set of XML files that are in the CFusion Live folder of your instance or your instance live. Anyway, you copy out the XML files and you put them into this new CF 2016, in my case, settings. Okay? And then up a level in this CFusion Live folder where my CF 2018 Neo XML files are, there's also something called admin config.xml. And I've already got that open. Just a second. So here's my admin config XML for my ColdFusion 2018 CFusion Live, my admin config XML. And in here, it's got these various settings for importing prior versions. And I would say I want to make 2016 settings be imported. Remember, I have to have put the files into ColdFusion 2018 for it to find them. And then I would say I want to run the migration wizard up here, true. All right. And all I got to do, and by the way, let me show you my CF administrator for CF 2018, currently open and running. I'm sitting here on my settings summary. We'll come back to that in a bit. But there I am, I'm already logged in. But I come over here and I save this file with the change for true and true. And now check it out. If I refresh the page now or click any link at all, up pops the box saying, oh, CF will now migrate the settings. Okay, so it's an automated feature, detects that you said you want to rerun the thing, and it would look in that folder and pull out those settings and import them in. I'm not going to do it because I've done things to my version since then, and so check it out. I can also just undo those changes, so false, and come back to my admin and refresh the page, and I'm back to looking at my page that I was on. So it's a nice thing you can do, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. Okay, cool. So that's the automated migration that you can trigger at any time. All right, moving on to the CAR mechanism. This may be of more interest to a lot of people because some people, A, don't even know it exists, or B, they thought they couldn't use it. So the CAR, ColdFusion Archive mechanism, can be used anytime to export out or import in CF admin settings from any instance to any other instance, even across versions. Now, it is based on a pop-up in the admin. So I'm going to go back over here to my administrator, and it's over here under this. In CF 2018, the interface, of course, looks different. Each of these is just a menu, the equivalent of what was a menu in CF 2016. In fact, let me show you CF 2016. It used to be down here under packaging and deployment, ColdFusion Archives. Well, all these things that are menus in CF 2018, now they're buttons. And I talked about this in my last session. you can see by clicking on the hamburger menu, there's the names and there's packaging and deployment. Or even if you don't do that, you can just mouse over it and it pops up. And for some reason, it's over on the middle of the screen saying packaging and deployment. And then finally, just a reminder for people that are new to CF 2018, there is this search feature up here. You click up there and you type in here car, and it'll find the ColdFusion archives. So one way or the other, you get to this ColdFusion archives. And the way it works, I've got some here, ignore that, but you either want to create an archive for exporting things out, or you want to deploy an archive for importing things in. That's the way to think of it. So I'm going to act like I'm going to create one, and I'll call it, test 2018. Now, when I click this button to do the create, it's at this point that it would pop up. And again, for some reason, it's something about my resolution that's popped up way down there. But if your browser had pop-ups turned off, this would not appear. And you'd click the button and nothing would happen. And you'd think, what the heck's going on? Well, in most browsers, there's going to be an icon up here at the top right telling you, and it might even pop up for a moment and say, hey, I blocked this pop-up. And then you can click a button to tell it, yes, I want to allow pop-ups. And you can either say allow it one time or allow any from this URL. And that would be the thing to do, tell it to allow any from this URL. Now, I'm not going to go into great depth on this. I just want you to see that that's how it works. You create it, you tell it you want to create an archive, and then you can either say, I want all my settings to be exported. Just click that button and it's done. Or I could pick and choose. I might say, I want to export a data source called whatever. Let's see. In a moment, it's going to come up. So it's looking in my administrator, finding my data sources, and I could pick one if I wanted to. And that would be it. I could say, I'm done. I don't have anything else. I just wanted that. And I could close this window. And it would now create an export of the definition of that data source. Or, of course, I can pick select all or deselect all and turn them on, turn them off. And you see the things you can do, mappings, data sources, scheduled tasks. Usually those are the things people need to do, but other things there, if those are interesting to you. If you want to, you can go to the bottom and see the archive summary, and it'll say, here's what we're going to bring. Since I said select all, the summary is going to say, I'm going to get not that, not that, not that, not that. I'm trying to hit the down arrow key. It's not going down. But data sources. So it's just going to get all my data, no mappings, no collections, no scheduled tasks. So that's it. And you can close the window. And that has now defined what it is you want to create. Now, here's where people sometimes miss. You're not done. So it was called Test 2018. There's 3 buttons there. Edit it, which would just open it up and let me change it again. Delete it, which I should have done with these before. And then this one in the middle called Build. And when you mouse over it, for some reason, my pop-ups are appearing in the middle of the screen, but for you, it usually appeared right there when you moused over it. So build is what you want to do next. And that also opens up a pop-up, which again, weirdly, something about my resolution that's down here. But anyway, I don't usually work on this monitor when I'm doing this stuff, but I did this monitor for you guys. So anyway, there it is, just showing you basically the summary saying this is what I'm going to do, and it's just got my data sources, and do you want to proceed? And again, that pop-up would not appear if you did not click that thing. So anyway, I say, yep, I want to proceed. And now it's going to ask, well, where do you want to create this car? So the car mechanism is about creating a car file, literally a .car file. And you just tell it where you want to create it. Now, this is where sometimes you can get into trouble. You need to put it somewhere that your ColdFusion can write to, right? So if you've changed CF to run as a limited user, you can't just tell it to write to the root of the Z drive, for instance. He may not have, the user may not have permission. So I would just tell you, write it to the ColdFusion directory because CF's going to have permission to read and write to itself. And I would just create it in there. And you do have to create it with a name you pick and with the .car. It tells you right there with the .car extension. You have to do that. Now, one other trick I'll tell you is I would recommend copy that to the clipboard before you hit submit, because if anything goes wrong with it, it's going to take it away. And if you the browser button and dug around in the system and found what you wanted and then picked it and added the name .car and then it lost it, you'd have to go do that all again. So copy it off to the clipboard and then click next. And if it's good, it'll say build successful. And if anything went wrong, like it couldn't write to the file or it didn't like what you told it to do or it couldn't do it for whatever reason, it would say not successful. And there would again be a log. We'll talk about that in a second. But that's it. That has created it. And if I were to go to my Windows Explorer, remember we were looking at my CF 2018 folder. So up here, there's my CF 2018 test 2018 car file. Now, one other tip I want to share with you is you might go, okay, well, first of all, let me just tell you what you would do with it is you would take this now and let's say go to another machine into which you would import it, and you would use that deploy feature. We'll talk about that in a second. But you might wonder, what is this thing? Well, it's just a zip. If you were to rename it, and I'm on Windows, so you guys on Linux can do things your way, but I'm just going to rename it to a zip. And by doing that with Windows Explorer, I can just drill into it. I just hit enter. I went into it. And it's got a folder called working dir. And in there, it's got a thing called server settings.xml. And currently my Notepad++ is set to open the file. So just a second, it'll open up. So that's what's in there. And remember, it was data sources. So I can see right there, SQL Server right in the middle. And yet it looks ugly. And yes, there's ways to clean this up, and we can talk about that later. But the point is, there is the XML. It's called the WDDX formatted. If you look at the top left corner, all the Neo XML files are WDDX formatted. And this has just got my data sources. If you look to the right, that's all it says it's got is var name data sources. I'm not going to go any further than this. I just want to tell you that it's just XML and it's just my data sources. Down at the bottom, you can see that's the end of the definition of my data sources. Now, before I go to that point, let me say that if we go back to the administrator, so if I went to another server, and then on that server, I'd go to package deployment, I would go to this thing, and I would, again, use the way to get to it, but I've got it on my clipboard, so I'm just going to point to it that way. So I'd point to the car, and you have to name the car, and I would click deploy, and it would pop up a box, and it would do the deploy. And I'm not going to bother doing that. Now, here's where things get interesting. The ColdFusion archive mechanism used to be only in enterprise for CF10 and earlier. So many people who don't have enterprise never got around to using it, never paid attention to it, never noticed it. But even people who had enterprise didn't know about it, didn't notice it. Well, since CF11, so CF11, 2016, 2018, now 2020, anybody can use it in standard or enterprise. So yeah, check out this car mechanism for doing these sort of export and import of settings one by one. And I did a blog post talking about that, and there's the URL to get to it, so you can be reminded of that, read about it, see when it happened, whatever. And so I meant to show that before I showed the demo, because I thought you ought to know you could do this. All of you can do this. Unless you're on CF10 standard or earlier, then you can't do it. But if you're on any version of enterprise or CF11, any version at all and above, you can use the car mechanism. And I already showed you that, how it's just a zip. And there is a log called the car log in the logs folder when you do an export, when you do an import, and there's a separate log for each export and each import in the ColdFusion logs folder. So you can always keep an eye on what's going on. And there is docs on this, and I showed that screen earlier. This is a PDF, and it's called the Migration Guide. And there was not only one for 2018, but 2016 and 11, and I believe even 10. Now, here's the thing. This migration guide, you guys know from this talk, the description, the announcement, it was only about admin settings. You wouldn't expect it to be about how do I migrate from one version of ColdFusion to another. Well, this guide called the Migration Guide, I'm sure a lot of people expect it to be something that talks about how to migrate from one version to another. This is it. I was just looking at a page within it. It's only 19 pages, and it's all about the archive mechanism and the migration wizard. It's not about how do you migrate from one version of CF to another. So it's great for what we're talking about. It's not great if you expected it to be how do I, what's compatibility issues and how do I migrate my code. It doesn't talk about any of that, unfortunately. I wish they did. That would make more sense for a migration guide. But anyway, it does talk about the car mechanism and the archive, automated migration wizard. So check that out on your own to get more insight and screenshots of the stuff that I just showed you. Now, before I move off of the topic of migration, I want to tell you what you should not do. People have been telling this for years. They've been doing it or telling other people to do it. Don't copy the Neo XML files from one instance to another. I'm just saying it's generally a bad idea to do it. And especially if you do it between versions of CF, like from 11 to 2018. The format of the XML could have changed. The arguments inside of it could have changed. The features in the version of CF could have changed. I've seen a lot of people get in trouble, and they were digging all around trying to figure out what the heck happened, and it was because somebody, as a shortcut, copied the Neo XML files. That's not what you're supposed to do. Either use the migration wizard or use the CAR mechanism. Don't copy the XML files. And I'm saying even between the same version of CF, I wouldn't do it because there's various things inside. For instance, the password for data sources, or the password for the mail settings, or the passwords for the URLs in a scheduled task. Those passwords are stored in encrypted values in the Neo XML files. And when you just copy the XML to another server, it's not going to work because it's encrypted. And the value by which it's encrypted is unique to the server on which that Neo XML file was created. So you can't do that. Now, when you do the archive and export mechanisms, it takes care of that. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But the point is that doesn't get handled when you do it yourself. So it's just generally a bad idea. That's all I want to leave it at. So let's talk about some considerations. What about the passwords? So I just said that in the case of the way they're stored in the Neo XML files and the way they're stored in the CAR, they're stored in encrypted form, and they're decrypted by CF using something called seed. And that seed's in a file called seed.properties. And that's different between instances by default. So you got to handle it. And the CAR mechanism and the migration feature are both designed to handle it. Now, there is something to be aware, and I just did a blog post on it last month, and there's the URL. Adobe announced in their most recent update a security warning, just pointing out to people, hey, be aware, you should secure these CAR files, because yes, it is encrypted form, but the seed is put in the XML as well. So if somebody got the XML, got the CAR file, they would be able to figure out how to decrypt it. So they're just saying protect the CAR file. If you create it, don't leave it sitting around forever on your server unless it's in a place that's very secure. If you're mailing it, think twice about mailing it in unencrypted form, because if somebody intercepted it, they could use the information in there. Now, if that's caught somebody's attention and you're freaking out, please take a moment and read the blog post. I get into it in much more detail. And this is a TLDR version blog post. And then I point to my own website where I go into more detail. So you can read more about this. It's not something to freak out about. It's just something to be aware of. All right, next, something to be aware of is that sometimes when you import settings, there might be version-specific numbers in some of the settings. It might be a path in a mapping that names the old CF version's web root. Well, again, the CAR and migration features do have features built in to do that. So it wouldn't bring in a reference to ColdFusion 11. It would change it to ColdFusion 2018. It would just do it. So that's nice that it does that. Then with regard to JVM args, be aware, some arguments that might have worked in one instance or one version of CF or on one machine might not work when they're imported to another. And one of the things you can do in the CAR mechanism and the auto migration is bring in JVM arguments. So just be aware, you might find that something that, quote, worked on one doesn't work on the new one. It might be that it's a thing that's specific to a given Java version and it wasn't, you were on Java 8 before and now you're on Java 11. Something may not work anymore. So just be aware of that. Or there might literally be a path, like you might in your JVM settings point to a specific Java version that you've modified from CF's default Java version. That's great. It's good to do for security. Well, when you bring the Java args from server A, where you had Java 8 251, and you bring it to server B, where you have not yet implemented Java 8 251, the Java home argument in the JVM config is going to point to a JVM that isn't there. And guess what? CF's not going to start. So we'll get back to that in a second. And then finally, there may also be JVM args supporting a tool that you haven't implemented on the new instance. So you might have had Fusion Reactor implemented on one instance, and it's got Fusion Reactor JVM arguments in there pointing to that instance. Now you bring those into the new instance, and you haven't yet implemented Fusion Reactor in that instance. And the folder may not be there. So why is this all a big deal? Well, these problems won't be exhibited when you do the migration or the import or the CAR import. They're going to happen when you restart CF. And that might be days or weeks or hours later. And I've helped a lot of people where they were scrambling to solve problems they've just restarted CF, maybe the box had to do a reboot for Windows update or Linux update, or they implemented some JVM change intentionally, and now they're restarting CF for the first time, and now CF won't start. And they're pulling out the hair thinking, what changed last night? Well, it may not be what changed. It may not be that you've restarted CF in 2 weeks. And somewhere between 2 weeks ago and now, somebody did a import of these settings and brought in these changes, and CF won't start because the settings don't work. So I'll tell you in a moment that as a best practice, when you do this import, you should restart ColdFusion right away just to make sure everything's working. And I'll talk more about that in a second. There's also some security-oriented settings to be aware of, and CF 2016 and above is particularly sensitive, and it says, hey, if I detect that settings you're bringing in might be less secure, I'm not going to do it, or I might warn you. The CAR mechanism and the migration wizard feature will both watch out for that, so that's cool. And they'll log that it didn't bring it in because it was deemed to be less secure, so that's good. So about the best practices, I'm just saying you should consider backing up the files that will be changed, and typically it's going to be those Neo XML files, and they're in the CFusion lib or your instance name lib, and then the JVM config, which is in your CFusion bin or your instance name bin. I'm saying you should manually back those up. The tools don't do it. I wish they did. They don't. So you should do it. And then again, after you do the import of either type, do a restart to make sure CF restarts, check your settings, make sure it's working, everything like that. And if not, look into what changed. And look at the migration logs to be maybe reminded something got brought in, and you might say, oh, wait, there's an argument that doesn't work. And you could compare things to the backup that you made in step 1. Now, here's the first little surprise. I want to say you can make that job easier than you might think. Now, these, you saw a moment ago, that WDX file. It's a big, stinking, ugly mishmash of XML. It's hard to manually eyeball compare it. It's hard to even compare it with whatever your favorite compare tool is. You may have, I know there's tools built into editors. There's favored tools you've used for 20 years or 10 years or 5 years or 1 year. But the problem is XML files don't care about the order of arguments within the XML, within certain ones. Like there's certain structure, but then within those things can be in whatever order they want. CF, when it writes things out, sometimes it'll write them out in different order. So you can't just do a text compare of 2 Neo XML files. They won't look right at all. But this tool Beyond Compare, what's cool is it's got an extension, a set of features called formats, and one of those available extensions is called XML sorted. So I'm going to open up my Beyond Compare right here, and I'm going to tell it, just to start out, I want to do something kind of simple. I'm going to point it to my ColdFusion. I don't usually use this approach to get to it. Let me just see if I've got it here. Yeah, there you go. I'm going to point to my ColdFusion 2018, or I'll do 2016 on this side. I'm looking in one direction, typing in another. That's why things aren't going quite right. So here's the Neo XML files. And let's just say I might want to compare the Neo XML mail file, right? So here's the Neo XML mail file. And like any compare tool, it's telling me they're different from each other. And most tools, you can just hit enter or double click on it, and it opens it up and it shows you where they're different. And actually, this is already showing you the benefit of the nifty feature that I was going to show you. So let me just change it back to this one. I don't believe it's formatted, so it doesn't make sense that it's showing up like that. But anyway, both of them should look like this. Look on the right. There's a bunch of, big long string. It's one long line of the Neo XML. That's all that's in there. And I don't know why on the left it's not showing that. It doesn't make sense to me. But the point is, ignore the left side. The right side is what would look typically when you even use a compare tool. And it's one line of XML, so you can't use the compare tool. It doesn't work. But this tool, Beyond Compare, which it's called Beyond Compare, it's I said it was free. It's not free. What it is, it's the best trial in the industry. It's 30 days of use, not 30 days from the day you install it, 30 days of use. So you could install it and use it once a week for 30 weeks. Great. And then when you buy it, it's only like 30 bucks. It's a bargain, totally worth it. You could use it for all kinds of great stuff. But anyway, the point is, it has these things called formats. And you can see the list of them to pick from them. There you go, file formats. So there's the list of them. And at the bottom, there's a link to their website to go get other ones. And I'll give you that link in a moment in the presentation. Well, if you go there, and remember, this is for any OS, so there'll be one for Linux, one for Mac OS, one for Windows. The one I'm using for this is called XML sorted. And there's XML tidied, and there's also JSON sorted, JSON tidied, really awesome tools. And you just get them for free, and you download them and install them. Just read the website that tells you how to do it. And then once you can configure it to always do it, and that's what I had happening, but I'm gonna pick XML sorted. And so check it out. On the right, you can really appreciate the benefit. It has taken what was that big honkin' mess of WDDX, and I think right now I'm not showing all, so let me just click all. There you go. And now we go to the top. There's the WDDX, and not only has it indented it to make it easy to look at, but it's also sorted it where it can. So what I'm saying is that in here, you're allowed to sort things. And actually, yeah, this says it's sorted. I don't see it sorted. But anyway, I got to move on. I don't have time to get buried in this. It's a great tool. It works really well, and it makes it easy to compare. I mean, look, you can see right now, port 25, they're the same. That would have been really hard to see. And if they were different, it would jump right out saying that they're different. I got to move on, though. Okay, so check that out. I'll leave you to get that link and read about it yourself. And I still see, yeah, and see someone saying Beyond Compare is fabulous. Yeah, it really is great. And I know there's other tools, and they're great too, but this one is just wonderful. I use it every day, and I love it. It's got things like that that really make it rise above others. So now, modern tools. So I mentioned that there's, from Command Box, a module, and let me just back up and say Command Box is open source from Ortus Solutions, and there's a module called CFCONFIG. Now, some of you know Command Box is a REPL for CFML, and it's great for that. Some of you know you can use it to start and manage instances of CF and Lucee, and it's great for that. But CFCONFIG is this module, which again is open source for free, and you can add it to Command Box. And again, it works not only with instances you've started and managed with Command Box, or someone might call box instances, but you can point it to any config folder of any CF or Lucee instance, and whether it's running or not. So it could be a copy of settings you brought from another machine. It starts to get exciting, right? And you can export and import settings across engines, so CF to Lucee or vice versa. Really cool stuff. So here's docs for it at ForgeBox and on the Ortus Solutions blog. And I would recommend you start with the blog post. That was a nice introduction to it. And then the docs are in the one above. Okay, so you would, in case you've never used Command Box before, I just want to clarify, you would just download and extract Command Box. It's an executable, literally, like for Windows, it's an exe, and there's available for Mac OS, Linux, Debian packages. I'll leave you to dig into that. But if you say for on Windows, you would just get the zip, extract it, and put it in a folder. Call it Command Box if you want. And in there, there'll be a program called box.exe. And you run that box.exe. And then it'll set up itself first time. And then you can implement the CFCONFIG module. And to do that, once you're in Command Box or have it installed, you can say install Command Box config. And it'll take a minute and do that. And once that's done, now you can either say box CFCONFIG or say box and go into the command line interface and just say CFCONFIG and pass it a command. And you would usually, with this stuff we're talking about, you'd use a from or a to argument that would name the folder holding the config settings. Now, again, most of the docs are going to talk about using it with Command Box instances, and you just name the instance. But I'm saying if we're talking about, you know, a ColdFusion instance that exists already or a Lucee instance that exists already, you'd use this from and to argument to point to the folder holding the configuration settings. So with ColdFusion, we've seen it's where the Neo runtime files would, or whatever NeoX and Neo files would be, which are in the lib. So ColdFusion C Fusion would be the folder in which the lib Neo files live. So you don't point to CFusion Live, you point to CFusion, okay? Or if you have an instance, call it Bob, whatever your instance name is. In the case of Lucee, you may know there's a web context and a server context. So with Lucee, the folder is wherever the Lucee web XML CFM file is, which for most people would be the context and then webinf Lucee. I'll show you a real example in a moment. And then for the server context, it's where this Lucee server XML file is, which would be, for instance, on Linux, it might be opt Lucee lib Lucee server. I was copying that from their docs, and I just noticed that they switched to the OS. But anyway, let me show you some examples. So you could get in, once you got it running, you can just say CFCONFIG help, and I've got it running. Let me just do a real quick couple of demos. So I can say box CFCONFIG help. Sorry. And you'll see their helpful reminders when you make a mistake. And this is not my first time running it. It shouldn't be slow. I don't know why that's taking so long. But anyway, while we're waiting for that, I don't want to be bogged down. We got to get going. So once you've got it, you could say CFCONFIG show, and I'll show you how to do it in a moment, and that would show all the settings in that admin of CF or of Lucee. All the settings would just dump out on the screen. You can say CFCONFIG export or import, and it would take all the settings and put them in a JSON file or read them out of a JSON file. You can't currently, as far as I know, you can't export only some settings, but you can edit the resulting JSON file, take out what you want, and then import that, for instance. So I've done that. And then they added a transfer feature, so it's CFCONFIG transfer, and again, you say from someplace to someplace, and it would just literally move them without any intermediate file. It would just say, I'm going to take the settings out of, say, CF 2018 and put them into Lucee, or vice versa. And then you can show and set individual settings, and you can list, save, and delete groups of settings like DSNs and mappings. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail with this. I just want you to be aware that it was possible. So here's some specific examples, and if my, there you go, it finally came back. I don't know why that happened, but let me just type correctly, config help. Now, again, it doesn't make sense that this is slow. I was running this the other day. I don't think I've got any problem going on. Let me just look. You won't see this. No, there's no high memory, no high CPU. Terrible. So it doesn't make sense. Something's amiss. It's not about command box. Trust me. That's usually snappy and fast. But anyway, there's the help for it and the commands that are available. All right. And to specifically, for example, sorry, I'm just trying to get the screen back. Come on. To do the show all my settings in my CF8 2018, I would literally just say CFCONFIG show from and point to my ColdFusion 2018. Okay, it's that simple. Try it yourself. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip demoing it. Just do it yourself. You'll see how it works. If you want to see a setting, you use the property attribute. And once you do the show, you'll see the settings and you'll see their names, and there's docs with it as well. But you know, the ColdFusion request timeout, the first setting on the first page of the admin is called request timeout in their JSON file. So you say CFCONFIG show property equals request timeout, and that's all you'll see is the value of that thing. And you can also leave off argument names in many cases. So I could just say CFCONFIG show request timeout in the ColdFusion folder. You don't have to always say like property equals the named arguments. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You'll figure it out as you work with it. And here's how to do it from Lucee. And this is literally, if you have Lucee on your machine, in your C drive, normal configuration installation, this should work. So saying show request timeout of that would get you the server level setting. And then if you wanted to see in a particular context, you'd say that longer name. I don't know why I added the from. I guess because I should have said show request timeout. Oh, I know what it was. My context didn't have a request timeout. You don't have to set it at the context level. So it didn't work. So I just want you to see, you could just say, I wanted to show an example that really did work, and this would really work. And notice it's Lucee Tomcat Web Apps, root webinf Lucee. It can be a little challenging to figure out where that stuff is, but they document it, and you can just dig around and find it. And then you can set things. So check this out. I'm setting the request timeout. It would have shown, when I did a show, it would have shown as 00060 by default. And I could just literally say set request timeout equals 61 in my CF20. And it immediately makes that change. Now, you would, of course, need to restart CF for that to take effect. Lucee can be configured to watch the files and detect it automatically. ColdFusion doesn't. Docs say it is possible, but that was just a WebSphere specific feature. I don't believe it's normally something that could be expected to restart just because you changed it. Anyway, moving on. Here's how you would export all the settings out of CF 2018 to a file called CF 2018 config. And then check this out. Once you're in the command box, they've implemented some Linux-oriented commands in that CLI. So if you're familiar with Linux, you could say cat, the name of the file, and you would see it on the screen. And they've also integrated with your OS in such a way that if you in the CLI, while you're in CFCONFIG and it's accepting commands, you could say edit a file and it'll open up whatever your editor is. For my case, it would have opened Visual Studio and I would have shown it, but we got to move on. All right, and then you can import. Now check this out. I'm importing the 2018 config into ColdFusion 2016. Yeah, it can do that. Absolutely. All right, so it's great. Definitely, like someone said, it is great. Can do a lot of great things. And there's a transfer from CF10 to CF 2018. If you had those folders, you could do it. And remember, you don't have to have the instances running. You don't even have to have the instances on the machine. You just need the folder. So you could call it, C ColdFusion 10, and as long as in there you had the lib and then the neo XML files, it would be able to do it. That's all it cares about. All right, and then you can also transfer between, say, ColdFusion and Lucee. Yeah, absolutely. So just got to get the folders right. That's all there is to it. That's what I want to stress. And finally, insofar as this migration stuff is the CF setup, which is like it. It's coming in CF 2020. It's been demonstrated public by Adobe, and Rakshith told me I could demo it for you guys. So it works a lot like CFCONFIG. Obviously, it works just for CF. I said just for 2020, but I've actually found that some things do work even against CF 2018. So I haven't seen if they're going to formally announce that or not. But anyway, don't confuse it with the other new thing in CF 2020 called a package management tool or package manager called CFPM. This is called CF Setup. And it's not in the bin folder, it's in the config folder. So ColdFusion 2020 config. And usually that's just where the WS config would be, if you know. But now there's a new folder called CF Setup. Okay, so it's config, CF Setup, and then it's got several commands, just like CF config. So you can say and I've got it here ready to go. Right, so I'm in the CF Setup, and I can say CF Setup. By the way, I didn't show you, but you can do that with box 2. I can say box CF config, and now I'm in the CLI for CF config. And I'll just bring this up on the screen to show. Where's my mouse? Come on. Running low on time. So I'm just going to say box. And then once I'm in there, I can say things like CF config, whatever. So I could say CF config help. So you're in the command box CLI, and you can do things like I was saying. In fact, you can say help and see that there's up above, it would tell you things like cat and edit. So anyway, my point was the CF 2020 CF setup also is a CLI. You say CF setup, and now you're in there, and I did the help, and there was the commands that are available for that. Now somebody's written, you would probably need to restart the instance. Yeah, I said that earlier. Sorry if you missed it. Yes, for CF, you would need to restart it. For Lucee, it can be configured to auto restart. So anyway, you can use show to see all the settings, or they have this concept of categories of settings, and you can see the categories by saying show category. And then again, you can export or import all the settings or all those in a category to or from a JSON file. So very similar in concept, and then individually settings can be get, set, add, or delete. And you can do it within an in category. I don't have time to demonstrate it. I'm going to leave it at that. Again, it's like that. And so here's examples. So I could say show all, and if my CF 2020 was in that folder, I point to the CFusion, I say show all, and it would show me all the settings that were in that admin. It just dumps them on the screen, just like CF config does, similar in concept. I can also export them all that way. Okay, so I just name the JSON file to which to export them. And I want to demonstrate that they've got this interesting feature where you can provide an alias, I'll call it CF, of that folder. And then I can just say show all CF. I don't have to repeat the folder every time. And I can say export all CF to this CF 2020 JSON. Pretty cool. Or check this out, you can also say select the alias name, and now it's like you're in a subfolder, as it were, of that context, as it were, and you could just say show all, and it's going to be of that CF instance. And you could say export all to the CF JSON, and it would just export all the settings. So that's pretty cool that they thought of that. I'll leave you to look into that more. And I've found that the show all work CF 2018 and even CF 11, not with CF 10, I found when I demonstrated it. So that did work, show all pointing to CF 2018. And I confirmed it was settings from CF 2018. I had changed something that was different in 2018 from 2020. So that's cool. Now, finally, passwords. Just be aware that unlike the car feature, both CF 2020 setup and command box CF config, when they create their export JSON file, the passwords are there as plain text. Both CF and command box CF config put the passwords in plain text in the exported JSON file. So you need to take due care with those exported JSON files if they're settings that would include passwords. So like data sources would have passwords. Mail might have passwords. Scheduled tasks might have passwords. All right, important, pay attention. You have been warned. And I just want to point out, as far as migration, finally, you could also automate the configuration of Adobe CF Docker images. It supports importing car files. If you put them in the data folder within the image or create a volume mount pointing to the data folder. You can also use a setup script environment variable naming a CF page to do an admin API call. I'll leave it at that. You can read more about that in the docs for the CF Docker images. CF 2020's Docker images have another thing called import CF settings, where you can name the JSON file that you created with the CF setup and import those settings. So that's really cool. And then they have an install modules environment variable to name modules. That's a new feature, that package manager. I'll just leave it at that. And then command box Docker images for either CF or Lucee, they have a CFCONFIG file environment variable where you can point to their JSON file that they created with CFCONFIG. So I just want you to know you can leverage these things I'm talking about even with Docker containers. And there's the docs for the Docker images, and it talks about that config file. I'll leave it at that. Now, finally, comparing, we got just a couple minutes left to wrap up. That's okay. So normally, if you wanted to compare settings between two versions, you'd like go and open up CF 2018, and like here's my data sources. Sorry, let me go to data sources. Okay, so there's my data sources. Sorry, I didn't mean to click that button. And then in my CF 2016, I go to my data sources. I don't have to log in there too yet. All right, so here's my CF 2016 data sources. Here's my CF 2018 data sources. And I could just go back and forth either with my mouse or with Control Shift Tab and go, is it different? Is it different? That's the old school way. Yes, you could do that. It's kind of annoying, but you could do that. If you didn't know this is pretty cool. You can also, up in the top right corner, there's an I. It's been here for many versions. I, and here in 2016, I. And this takes you to what they call the settings summary. Sorry, that's the system information page, my bad. What we want to do is the settings summary. They're close, but watch the size of the scroll bar here. This is like half, it's like 2 or 3 screens worth. If I go to settings summary, that scroll bar is going to become tiny because the settings summary, unlike the system information, has a bunch of stuff in it. And check out all the stuff that it's got. After you get past this stuff, there's my server settings. There's my client variable setting. There's data sources, later scheduled tasks. So my point is, if you're wanting to compare things, you could also come into, it was under the first button, and it's the first button, and it's the last thing called settings summary. And again, you can use the search to find it, settings summary. And it just takes a moment to come up. It's coming up in a moment. There it is. So anyway, now there I could look in here at my data and services section. I'm waiting for it to come up. I don't know what's going on. Demo gods are against me today. And while I'm waiting, does it have a magic file name like command box CFCONFIG JSON that is auto-loaded? No. Are you referring to how the command box Docker images auto import things. I don't remember that. I've seen that. But anyway, let me just say no, it doesn't have that particular magic file name, no. So anyway, here's my settings. And all I was trying to say is you could come in here, and we're almost done. So if y'all will stick with me just a few more minutes, we'll be good to go. So here's my data and services for CF 2018. Here's my data and services for CF 2016. And at least I could just go back and forth this way. It's a little easier to look. I could even compare things like the underlying JDBC URL or any connection string. That was a little harder to see in the admin screen. You could do that. That's the next better way. And note there is a PDF feature up here in the top right corner of the settings summary. There's a save as PDF, and that's been there again forever. It's in 2016, 11, 10, 9. You could save these as PDFs, and somebody might like to hand them to somebody and say, hey, sit down at your desk and compare these, and that might work. That would work. But the best one, there's a couple ways that are better, so much better. One is use Beyond Compare or any compare tool. At this point, you could use any compare tool. I just want you to get this in your head. Use a compare tool. What you want to do is go to the settings summary. So I'll come to here, and I'm just going to click in here. I'm not clicking on anything. I'm not highlighting anything. I'm just clicking in here. It's a frame. And if I do a select all by doing Control A, or if I right click, and if I've not selected anything, if I right click, I can say select all. Where is it? I don't do stuff this way, but anyway, you can highlight it and do copy. But when I do a Control A in any browser, that works. It selects all the text in that frame. It's not getting the stuff on the left. It's just getting the stuff in that frame. And I'm going to take advantage of that. I've highlighted it. I've Control C'd it, and I'm going over to my Beyond Compare. And you can say session, new session, new session. Text compare. So I'm not comparing folders, not comparing files. And I'm just going to come in here and click on the first line and paste in. And if I go to the top, there it is. And it says when click generates PDF. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Leave it there. Then I'm going to go to my CF 2018 and do the same thing. I'm going to click in here, do a Control A, Control C. I'm not controlling what I pick. It doesn't matter that they're different versions, trust me. And then now check it out. You need to, like when it started out, it was down here. You wouldn't want to paste it in down here. You want to get up to the top. I'm using Control Home. You can use your mouse. Get to the top up there at the very top and paste it in at the very top. And so check it out. Sure, they added a comma for the when clicked. Okay, I don't care about that. And yeah, the date and time has changed. I don't care about that. And yeah, there's my CF 2016 versus 2018. If I was comparing two 2018s, I might see that one is update 10 and the other is update 9. That's pretty cool. And then Tomcat versions, that could be interesting. And with a tool like Beyond Compare, you don't have to just look for each one and click next, next, next. You can say, just show me the differences. I don't care about what's the same. Just show me what's different. Again, something's acting weird. I don't know what it is. That should have just changed. This mic turn off has been so frustrating. I realized what it is. It's this context. That's a nice feature. It shows the lines surrounding what changed. For a moment, I'm going to turn it off. And yeah, now I just see what's changed. And there's the comma, and there's the version, and there's the Tomcat, and I'm just seeing that. And I can come down here and say, oh, I have a site-wide error handler on this one. I don't on that one. Oh, I set the maximum size of the post data to 200 on that one. It's only 20 still on this one. Awesome, right? And then there's stuff where here, those settings on the right, those executor pool configurations, that's new in 2018. Doesn't exist in 2016. So it just doesn't show it. Awesome stuff. It's really great. Makes your life so much easier. All right. So I love that tool. And so you can come back and read about how to do that yourself. And then finally, the second surprising approach, and some of you probably wondered why I didn't mention this earlier, command boxes, CFCONFIG has a diff command. Yeah. So I could just say CFCONFIG diff from 2016 to 2018, and it will show on screen what's different. And I'll just go ahead and do that one real quick. Can I highlight from this? No. So let me just hop over to my presentation. Good. And by the way, guys, if I find any problems with how things have rendered in the presentation, I'll just do it again and do a recording and post it as an alternative. So here I am in command box, and It's kind of like Linux command line where I have to right click to paste it. Can't do a control V. But anyway, there you go. There's my CFCONFIG diff from my 2016 to my 2018. And it's going to show the same sort of differences. And it shows what's the same in green and what's different in red. And it's got its own ordering of things, and we're at the bottom of the list. So it's what I do like about the settings summary is it presents them in the groups in which they exist really in the administrator, and that makes it somewhat easier. But this is still very valuable, and it's quick and easy. And you might go, yeah, but I'd like to just see what's different. Yeah, you can see what's different. So there's a additional argument called, oh yeah, there it was, values differ. Values differ. So I'm just going to repeat that command and add values differ. It's kind of a curious choice of name, but that's what they did. So there you go. And now I'm only seeing what's different between the two, and it is showing the encrypted value of the password, thankfully, so you guys don't see my passwords. But I'm saying if I had exported those, the JSON would have had the real password. So anyway, so that's nice that you can see only the differences. And what I wanted to point out was when you're comparing different versions or different engines, if you do the values differ and something is in one and not the other, it just won't show up with values differ. It doesn't, with like beyond compare, we could see on the left there was something, on the right there was nothing, or vice versa. With the show values differ, it just says of the settings that are in both, which ones differ. And there's value to that, so just be aware. And then if you wanted to, they do add a from only and a to only additional arguments. And if you did that, then it'd be like a left compare, and it would say, well, show me what is in the left that's not on the right, as well as what's different, or show me what is on the to but it's not in the from. So anyway, you can solve that problem. Just want you to know that's how to do it. And then finally, they do have a report feature for the diff. So you can create an HTML or create a PDF and give it to somebody and say, go figure this out, go solve it. So you just add an attribute to the CFCONFIG diff. You just add this at the end of the line, saying, for instance, HTML report path, and you point to a folder and a file, or PDF report path, and you point to a folder or a file. And here's an example. So if I just did what I did up there, it was slightly different. CF10, CFusion to CF11, CFusion, PDF report path. That would be all on one line, and diff PDF would be created in that folder. Boom. So very nice. All right. So sorry, we're a few minutes over. So there's many ways to do the migration and comparison of both CF and Lucee admin settings. Remember, for migration, we've got the migration wizard, which can either run automatically or be configured to rerun. We got the CAR mechanism to export or import any setting you want. Is available in CF11 and above on standard and enterprise. Prior to that, only on enterprise. Then the command box CFCONFIG, which can be used not just with the command box stuff, as you've seen now multiple times, and CF20 CF setup, which is by and large going to only work with CF2020, but maybe will work some with earlier versions. And as far as comparison, we saw we could just compare in the browser, we could do beyond compare, or we can use CFCONFIG diff. So if you have any other questions, I haven't seen any questions that I haven't answered, but I'll stop now and say, go ahead if you have any questions. I'm happy to take them, or you can reach out to me at the contact information in the bottom right corner, and I'll be happy to help. So here's a question. jar libraries installed in CFusion Live for the purpose of adding functionality, right? Are they copied during a migration or an upgrade, or do they have to be copied manually? I'm pretty sure they have to be copied manually, and I'm pretty sure that the mechanisms tell you that, or at least the migration. One of the boxes that come up, I believe it tells you, hey, we'll bring the data source definition, but we're not going to bring the jars, for instance. So if whoever's Michael there is saying that he's aware that, for instance, if you want to use MySQL, you have to get a MySQL jar. Or if you want to use the Microsoft JDBC driver, you got to get the Microsoft jar. And you have to put that in the ColdFusion Lib folder, CFusion Lib. And he's right. When you bring it to the other server, if it's not there, it ain't going to work. So I don't think it does it for you. Excellent question, but I don't believe it does do it for you. So just keep an eye on that. By the way, that compare, I don't know if I still have it on the screen. This is cool. Where's beyond compare? Yep, it's a tabbed interface. Oh yeah, here you go. So this is it. Those appear up at the top in the class path. So you can look at this class path and see if there's a lib that's in one that's not in the other. And by the way, it's wrapping, so it's a little hard to see down here at the bottom. When you have a big long line, you can scroll along that big long line and see what's different. And you could also use a feature in there to sort it, I believe. But anyway, let's move on. And he was adding that he was referring to things like OpenSAML and other, yeah, absolutely. So no, it wouldn't know about those libraries. I thought it might possibly help with the data source, but I don't think it does either. I think that leaves it all to you. You got to bring lib folders over. So good question, but nope, doesn't do it for you. Any other questions? You got anybody else? All right, well, there's the slight possibility that somebody's waiting off the recording to ask a question. So I'll go ahead and stop now. Thank you all for coming. Again, the recordings will be posted afterward. If there's any problem with it, I'll redo it, no problem. And we'll see some of you tonight for the next session, which will be on PWAs. How did we get here? And you can read more about that at coldfusionmeetup.com. Till again, you bet. Thank you all.